Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 2018 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Dr. Michael Wilson. Michael is a faculty emeritus in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Douglas College in Coquitlam, BC. Michael was born in England but moved to Canada at the age of 2 and grew up as a proud Calgarian. He obtained a bachelor's degree in geology and archaeology at the University of Calgary, and after graduating, he moved to the U.S. to pursue a master's degree in archaeology at the University of Wyoming. For his thesis, he studied the Holocene evolution of bison on the Great Plains and elsewhere in North America. Subsequently, Michael returned to Calgary to pursue his PhD in archaeology at the U of C. For his dissertation, he studied the geology and archaeology of the Bow River Valley in Calgary. After completing his PhD, Michael taught at a variety of institutions in Alberta, the US, China, and Japan before being hired by Douglas College in BC, where he was instrumental in the establishment and growth of the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences until his retirement in 2014. Since then, he has done occasional consulting, most notably the study of the impact of the 2013 Alberta flood on quaternary paleontological and paleoenvironmental sites along the Bow River Basin. Michael's research interests include quaternary vertebrate paleontology, geoarchaeology, quaternary stratigraphy, human relationships with landscape, taphonomy, and biogeography. Over the years, he has conducted fieldwork in Western Canada, the Western U.S., Northwest Mexico, China, Japan, and Cameroon. At present, he is conducting archival research, tracking down early discoveries of mammoths and other megafauna in Western Canada. Today, Michael will present an overview of the Ice Age mammals that have been discovered on Vancouver Island. So without further delay, I present you Dr. Michael Wilson.
Thank you, Francois. Okay, I'd like to emphasize today that what I will be talking about is fairly thematic. I'm not going to go through a bunch of sites, Site 1, Site 2, Site 3, Site 4. I'd like to actually pick some general interpretive themes and tell you what we can do in the analysis of certain vertebrate fossils. Intriguing ones. I'm going to be talking about the area of the Pacific Northwest that comprises the lower mainland of British Columbia a little bit, Vancouver Island, of course, the Gulf Islands. And south of the Gulf Islands, if you're just in the northern part of Puget Sound, I'm in an airplane around Bellingham looking west here in this picture at the Olympic Peninsula and the Olympic Mountains. And we're going to be talking about Orcas Island, which is right here, this funny horseshoe-shaped island in the San Juans. I'll be mentioning that quite a lot. But again, I want to talk about themes of the colonization of these areas in the wake of the retreat of ice some 14,000 years ago. I want to start by giving credits because a lot of times the credits are left to the end, and sometimes so little time is left that they're just clicked through really quickly. And I want to emphasize that really I'm working with 3 different teams of people here. I've left my own name off because I'm a part of each one of these. I just don't want to be repeating my own name. But there's a group of people working on San Juan Islands and also at the Manus site, which is a mastodon site on Olympic Peninsula. And so included there, Steve Kennedy, Randall Shaw, Bob Mierendorf, and myself. We've been working on this for quite a while now. A second team is working on bison remains from the southern part, the Saanich Peninsula, Victoria area of Vancouver Island. Grant Keddy, Richard Hebda, and I. You can see Grant Keddy there in the yellow shirt in the lower right. And in the upper picture, that is Steve Kennedy actually doing an X-ray of one of the bison from Orcas Island. Another team has been working on Port Eliza Cave, which is a cave on the west side of Vancouver Island that has a fauna from just before the last glaciation, so around 18,000 years ago, just before the ice arrived in the area. And there we have microfauna, actually small vertebrates that have, they're useful in terms of this present discussion, though I don't want to talk about them too much. I'm going to just refer to a particular thing about them that helps us out here. And of course, there are a lot of other people that I would like to thank. Over the years, I've received a lot of information, encouragement, and so forth from a variety of people. Some of them are listed here. People from a variety of different agencies. Ted Danner is photographed in the upper right there, and Dick Harrington in the lower right. They've both been involved in some of the earliest studies in this area. Ted Danner, a geologist at UBC, passed away some years ago and was very, very supportive of the Paleontological Society, the Vancouver Paleontological Society, and trying to encourage avocational paleontologists. And I also want to credit the Douglas College Scholarly Activities Fund because I received funding from them to do some of this work. And at the outset, I should mention that much of the work I'm going to talk about today, a lot of the Orcas Island work, was self-funded by our group. We actually just paid it out of our own pockets, including some of the early radiocarbon dates. So this has become important, actually, in terms of our acceptance in the local area, shall we say. And what I can't do in this presentation is thank all of the individual finders of specimens and sites along the way, because I'm not going to be discussing the individual sites. There's a long list of other people, and I just want to say that I'm endlessly grateful to these people for having really helped us out. And in other presentations, I've been able to provide them with thanks. Well, what are we dealing with here? Science is the enlightened inquiry about the natural world, of course, but it really has a lot of parallels to mysteries, murder mysteries. You know, it's kind of the whodunit thing. We are searching for clues, of course, and there's always missing information. That's one of the troubles. Just like in a murder mystery, you think, oh, I wish we knew. But there's a way around it, as the mystery is always solved by somebody who finds a way around the missing evidence. Well, we've got that problem as well. People are involved, of course. That's really a problem, and the people are scientists, and we're the biggest problem of all. I have to say at the outset that I'm working on all of these projects, and you think, oh, he's a coordinator. He's sort of pushing all of these things ahead. I'm probably holding all of them back, to be truthful. But anyway, people are a problem, but people are great, you know. So, but science, the interesting thing about science, is different from a murder mystery. In a murder mystery, you know, you turn that last page and, oh, that's who did it. Oh, now it's all solved, you know, and the bad guy gets arrested, and that's the end of the story. In science, well, we end up with questions. And sometimes the general public says, well, this is crazy. You didn't do anything. You ended up by asking more questions than you started off with. But what's the value of that? Well, I'll tell you, knowledge is open-ended. The natural world is open-ended. And so every inquiry that we make to answer one question puts us in view of other things that we hadn't thought about, new questions we should be asking. And in fact, if a scientific study does not ask more questions than it answers, it's really not doing its job. It's not looking forward. And all you got to do is think of an explorer going down some river that's not been explored before, and off in the distance are some mountains, and the explorer is saying, oh, I wonder what's over there. That's what we're up to. We're going down the river, we're establishing information about the river, but we're seeing those mountains in the distance and wondering, oh, what do they mean? What could we find over there? So there's always more to discover. And I hope you get the idea today that I'm not only answering questions, but I'm laying out questions for future research. Now, the story starts, really, this story starts with Ted Danner, because he was a geologist at University of British Columbia. He did his dissertation was done in the San Juans and that surrounding area of northwestern Washington. In 1957, he was doing some work on Orcas Island, and there was an excavation into a wetland, and he found shells, marine shells, which is not unusual there from the Ice Age, but he also found some bones, and the bones were intriguing. He didn't know what they were, but he saved them anyway. They were bone fragments. He sent them initially to Ian McTaggart Cowan a zoologist at UBC, who forwarded them on to Loris Russell. And many of you have probably heard of Loris Russell, a paleontologist. He was at University of Toronto and the National Museum of Canada. Well, he wrote a letter back saying, I've numbered these 1 through 7, whatever it was, with crayon, and here's my description, you know. So he wrote a little description of each of the bones, sent it back to Danner. And I was, in 1968, as a kind of, as an undergraduate, feeling very puffy with my potential for the future, I embarked on an investigation of bison occurrences in British Columbia. Now, I lived in Alberta at the time, but I was surrounded by bison material over here. There's too much of it, right? But there's another issue. If you really want to know about the evolution of an animal group or about its ecological tolerances, you don't work in the middle of its range. You try to find the periphery of its range and look at the dynamics there. What's happening when climate changes? Are they shrinking in range, expanding in range? What happens when they're under stress? So I was interested in picking the margin of the bison range and actually looking to see what we could find out about stress responses through time with these animals. So I was over in British Columbia, actually, in '68, visiting Charlie Borden at the University of British Columbia. He told me about this material. I got in touch with Ted, and wow, this sounds exciting. The only problem was we weren't sure where the material was. We had the letter from Loris Russell. Dick Harrington also had the letter, and thanks to Ted Danner, Ted had sent it to Dick Harrington. And Dick Harrington in '75 actually appended a little, he was writing an article about fossil musk oxen, and he wrote a little appendix to it saying, oh, by the way, there's this bison material from Morris Island, and he repeated the information from Loris Russell's letter. But apparently, actually, as I find out, I don't think Dick had the material either, and he was wondering where it was. So Harrington thought that this, you know, Russell had said it's larger than modern. And so Dick thought, you know, it's credible. This could represent Bison antiquus, the fossil bison, giant bison, if you want to call it that. Or it might represent a wood bison, which is bigger than the modern animal. The wood bison is bigger than the modern plains bison, and even today's wood bison. So it wasn't really clear. Well, I wanted to study these fossils then very urgently to find out what they really represented. The various questions were asked about them. It took me 40 years to find them. I never give up. I did not stomp around for 40 years hoping to find these things, you know, hoping. The news media always say, they stumbled across it. Scientists stumbled across. Do you know, we often stumble across things in the process of very dedicated searches where we're actually looking at the ground, trying to find things, or in my case, looking in museums. I was in the museum, the UBC Museum of Zoology, and looking for something else. And Rex Kenner, bless his heart, said, you know what, we just found a box of stuff. You might be able to tell us what this is. We're not sure what it is. It's labeled Lummi Island. Now, Lummi Island is an island nearby Orcas Island. I don't know of anything from Lummi Island in this case, in this kind of material. Anyway, he pulled out the box, and I looked at it. There was a bag inside, and here was a bone, bison bone fragment, with a crayon number on it. And I thought, oh my gosh, this sounds very, very familiar. I think these are the things we've been looking for all these years. And sure enough, I was able to rephotograph them, and you can see, in this case, my photograph of the fragment of a humerus, and here is Ted Danner's photograph of it in the field. It's dried out a little bit, changed color. The other elements were present. This is a metacarpal, a bison metacarpal in the middle right, and a bit of a distal condyle from a metapodial there as well. Anyway, they were all there. We tried to radiocarbon date them, and we were not successful, unfortunately. But anyway, so our detective story was underway. Now, what did this all mean? Well, At the same time, now it was 2008 when we finally located these things. In 2006, before I actually came across the original material from Orcas Island, Steve Kennedy was in touch with me, Steve who had worked a lot on Orcas Island, to say that a bison had been found there. And I thought, what? I'm looking for one. What is this? Well, it turned out that Tony and Nancy Ayer were actually excavating, they were enlarging a wetland and returning it to pond status. It had kind of filled in with peat. And for habitat enhancement and so forth, they were opening up a wetland on their private property. In the process, the backhoe brought up a partial bison skeleton, Bison antiquus. And you can see in the upper right there the cranium of this delightful big Bison antiquus male. By the way, you may notice an oblique mark on the nasal there. It's actually got a healed fracture of the nasal. In the lower left is a kind of a cartoon drawing showing where these bones were situated, more or less at the base of a peat deposit associated with a pond clay resting on top of old glacial-marine deposits. At the time, we just were sort of wondering what this all meant, of course. That's turned out to be crucial for us in terms of understanding why these bones were preserved and where we can find others. So this is now an open pond, of course. The water has been filled back in. And bless their hearts, the Ayers actually made this available to us. The specimen is now in the Orcas Island Historical Museum and is available for study. Now, it wasn't the only thing that was found there. There was a partial skeleton associated with this large male. There was also, as you can see in the lower center there was half of a calf skull that came up in the backhoe excavation in a different place in the pond area. And there was an isolated adult female toe bone, as you can see in the upper right. So there were additional specimens. So it's kind of like the first family here. We've got a male, a female, and a calf, and not necessarily all of the same age, but enough to tell us, well, this isn't just a wandering male bison. And that's important, by the way, because male bison are kind of like male human beings. When we get elderly, we get confused and prone to wandering. I'm sort of, I should wear that on my T-shirt. But no, actually, male bison do wander around, especially the older male bison. They'll travel considerable distances outside their base range and pop in quite odd situations. We'll find their skulls, we'll find their skeletons up in mountain passes and so forth where we don't find any other bison remains. They're almost always old males. And I think it's because they've been basically eliminated from the association with herds and so forth. Bull groups are small anyway and don't associate with the main herds until certain times of year, but they've probably been turfed out even by the smaller, more vigorous males, and so you got these old guys who are kind of wandering around what to do next. But here, that's not the story. There's more to it, because there are young ones here as well. So, and by the way, we got a radiocarbon date on that specimen. The radiocarbon date was just around 12,000 radiocarbon years, which means about 14,000 calendar years before present. The radiocarbon curve has to be calibrated because radiocarbon levels have fluctuated in the atmosphere over time, so we have to correct it back, and we do that by reference to tree rings, dated tree rings. That allows us to figure out what needs to be adjusted in the radiocarbon record. Anyway, meanwhile, on Vancouver Island, in 1987, a little bit beforehand, another Bison antiquus skull was found. With a vertebra was associated with it, an atlas vertebra as well. That was it, but again in a wetland in northern Saanich Peninsula, so about where the ferry goes across from Tsawwassen to Swartz Bay. If you're taking the ferry across to Vancouver Island, you're on to Saanich Peninsula, and it's very, very close to that place where the bison was discovered. So it was in a very similar situation. Another bison was found at Royal Oak, just out of Victoria, again at the base of a peat deposit. And other more fragmentary specimens had been found much, much earlier, sometimes even decades further ago. They were in the Royal BC Museum, and we'd all been scratching our heads wondering what they might have meant. So there was quite a bit of archival work to figure out what they all meant. So the questions emerged. Of course, how ancient were these bison? Were they all the same age? What about other large mammals? Were the bison alone? What was going on here? Early postglacial times? How did they get to the islands? What was the mechanism? Was there a land bridge? And of course, what does this mean really for people and animals today? There's a relevance to be thought about there too. Okay, so the radiocarbon dating was quite successful for a number of the finds. A few of them couldn't be dated. The collagen had been destroyed in the bones by the burial environment. But they all date from between about 14,000 and 12,000 calendar years, or calendric or calibrated years ago. So the radiocarbon dates would be from 12,000 to 10.5, and so we adjust that back. But and without a doubt, they are then not just wood bison from fairly recent past. They are the extinct form, Bison antiquus. Now, I gotta be careful. Extinct there doesn't mean that the species disappeared completely. It actually, this form was ancestral to the modern bison. So they were much larger than the modern bison, but they gradually evolved into smaller and smaller and smaller bison over time. So whereas some of the other Ice Age mammals became extinct, some of the big guys, the Megafauna, these bison disappeared in a different way by evolving into a smaller form. The interesting thing is, wow, the horns on these ones are actually small, very small for Bison antiquus, unusually small. When you compare them with Bison antiquus for the rest of North America, these guys are strange. Their heads are just as big, their bodies are just as big, but their horns are smaller. Now, maybe that's what we call an island effect. So we'll have to look into that. And maybe if there's an island effect, they seem to have been perhaps a little bit isolated on these islands for a time. We've got to look into that and see if they really were. Okay, let's back up. Let's put it in perspective a little bit. All that ice has me thinking of water, so I needed a drink of water here. At the peak of the last glaciation, we will refer to that as the last glacial maximum, is the peak, or the last glacial. We actually refer to it specifically as the last glacial now. That's wishful thinking, isn't it? That's like saying there aren't going to be any more. But anyway, ice covered a lot of Canada, even Ottawa. But there was a Laurentide ice sheet off in the east, you see, dominating the main part of the continent, the northern continent, and then the Cordilleran ice sheet in the mountain areas. The two of them coalesced in Alberta, so that makes Alberta a very, very interesting place for closure and opening of the ice sheets. But we're in that circle area down in the Pacific Northwest, looking at the area along the southern fringe of the Cordilleran ice sheet, and in particular a lobe of ice extended down into Washington in the area that's now Puget Sound. In fact, the presence of Puget Sound is in part enhanced by the former erosive action of that ice lobe, so there's a bit of interplay there. Anyway, that's what it looked like. You know what it looks like today, and we know that these ice masses were well into retreat by 14,000 years ago. Land was opening up very, very quickly. 12,000 years ago, cal years ago, the glaciers were essentially restricted to the upper mountain areas. And through the wonders of paleophotography, we are able to go to the past and photograph what it was like back then. I took the photograph in the upper left of that's the Johns Hopkins Glacier in Johns Hopkins Inlet, Glacier Bay, Alaska. Shedding icebergs. It's a very active, nasty glacier. But just to show you what a glacier would have looked like coming down into the, basically into the tidewater area. That's a tidewater glacier. So there's still glaciers today that are very active, coming off high mountains, as in the St. Elias Range and other high ranges along the northern Pacific coast. Over on the lower right, you see a photograph that my late wife took as we were flying over Greenland. And so that stands as a nice paleo photograph of lower mainland British Columbia during the height of the last glaciation. It would have looked kind of like that. So now we've gone from the presence of this ice to the absence. You can see in those illustrations the Puget Lobe extending down into Washington. And of course, in the wake of its presence, you now have Puget Sound, which is a bunch of interconnected inlets of various kinds and things they call canals. Hood Canal is a part of the Puget Sound area, for example. This long, slender water body here, but it's really what we would call, in Canada, we call it an inlet. So that sets the background, and these animals were appearing in the area in the wake of the ice retreat. I'm focusing here on a few site locations. Southeastern Vancouver Island, Sandwich Peninsula, you see there a number of bison sites, half a dozen of them, just in the Victoria to Sandwich Peninsula area. The Manus Mastodon site, which we'll mention a little bit at the end, is on Olympic Peninsula, the north end, at a place called Squim. And the San Juan Islands, we're going to be looking at the Ayer Pond site on Orcas Island, again indicated there. And of course, to the south, what we call the Puget Lowland. There were other large animals in this area. The bison have a lot to tell us. Other animals have a lot to tell us too, and we're gradually gliding over to looking at them. We have more bison finds than anything else, and please forgive me. I worked on bison on the Great Plains. I love bison, and they seem to have followed me to the Pacific Northwest. But it happens that they're a little bit more abundant than the other kinds of fossils, and so they tell us certain things that others cannot. But there's, on Orcas at Ayer Pond, there's actually a large cervid of some sort too, maybe an elk. It's part of an antler, so we know that there was one of that kind. Mountain goat were present on Vancouver Island, and they're not present today there. And Jefferson's ground sloth was also found on Orcas Island in a similar setting, not at Ayer Pond, but at another site on the Health Cell property. Giant short-faced bear has been found, both on Vancouver Island and on the San Juans, on San Juan Island. Arctodus simus, that's a bear that doesn't exist today. Bigger than a grizzly bear, bigger than a Kodiak brown bear, a very, very big bear, long-legged bear. And it's only relative today. It's not really a true bear in a sense. It's what we call an arctothere. It's related to the spectacled bear of South America. That's its only living relative. And the interesting thing about the spectacled bear is that it's a frugivore. It eats fruit, not meat. Anyway, black bear and brown bear were also present. And interesting enough, after the last glacial maximum, it looks like mammoths weren't present in the area. Mastodon was present at the Manus site 14,000 years ago, mammoths not. And it seems like the mammoths simply didn't get back in time before their extinction. They were present off to the south, but they just simply didn't disperse northward rapidly enough to establish themselves in this area after the ice retreat. So you can think of the mammoths as kind of plodding a little bit. But anyway, so far we haven't got them, but I suspect we might find them. So this story involves relative sea level change. Then we're going to think about climate change, the retreat of the ice. Tectonism, tektos, to build in Greek. Tectonism is a term we used for changes, geological changes involving movement of land masses up and down, sideways, faults, folds, things like that, but also the upward and downward movement of land in response to loading by things like ice. When ice was present, the land was actually pushed down. Ice retreats, the land comes back up again. It's kind of neat. So We're going to think about bison, but we also got to think about mice. So yeah, I'm prepared to work on mice from time to time too. And the possibility that there's a filter bridge, that in other words, some animals can cross over and some can't. Were they swimming to get to these islands? How did they get there? And was there a winter ice pack providing some sort of a temporary bridge? All of these questions occur. We don't have answers completely to all of these questions, by the way. We're still working with it, but we're getting there. Microtus townsendii in the middle at the bottom there is a modern critter that you find on Vancouver Island, and will pop up again in our story. Okay, so I've talked about the upward and downward movements of the land. When the ice was present, think of the volume of water that represents. Had it melted, as in the modern world, where the water simply runs back down to through the rivers to the ocean again, the ocean levels are high. But now you have precipitation coming originally from the oceans, falling as snow, and it's now being stored in the glaciers. It's not going back to the oceans. And so the ocean levels were much lower for a while in the last glacial maximum, probably 120 meters lower than the present day. That's a big, big difference. And so that could expose platform areas that are underwater today. But wait, there was ice present out to the coast as well in these places, and that ice was pushing the land down. So the difference wasn't as much as you would think, depending on where you are. Certain areas, the difference was not very much. Certain areas, the difference was a lot. With the ice retreat then, it was kind of a race. The ice retreated, and so sea level is rising up from all the meltwater input. But the land is also coming back up, so now it's a race between the two to see who gets there first. And in some cases, one was before the other, So each individual area has its own relative sea level history then, from one island to the next. Between the San Juans and Victoria, they might not have the same relative sea level history. So it's very important that we work out the history in each one of these places. And it is possible, indeed, that there were land bridges between the islands, or between islands and mainland for short periods of time during this process. Well, we got to have some unintelligible diagrams here. It's a scientific talk, but basically look at the sawtooth in the upper image there, and that's just showing you water, essentially the cold to warm swings in ocean temperature, in ocean cores. It shows you that there's a swing from cold to warm to cold to warm to cold to warm, which we are able to link to the glacial sequence. And the bottom one actually shows you the number of meters that sea level was below present at various times. And so 20,000 years ago, 18,000 years ago, sea level was much, much lower than it is today. The mean sea level at present is indicated on the diagram, and you see that it's in excess of 120 meters below that at the time of the last glacial maximum. Wow, that's big news. Well, it isn't, because it's already known. I'm not reporting it as new news. But anyway, what's important here is the vertebrate fauna that I mentioned from Portaliza Cave, the mice. Mice have value. You might not like them in your house, but we like them in caves. The fauna there includes a whole variety of things, fish and toads and birds and voles and marmot and marten and so forth. And the dates are useful in limiting the ice advance, but there's a very important hint in the mice themselves, because, you see, there are 3 species of voles present at Portaliza. 3. So you've got the Townsend's vole, you've got long-tailed vole, and you've got heather vole. And the trouble is that 2 of those don't occur on the island today. And yet they occur on the adjacent mainland quite abundantly. They're there, but they're not on Vancouver Island today. So, before the ice, you had 3. After the ice, you had 1. It means only 1 species was able to make it back, or to survive maybe in some marginal habitat in the area. There's some filtering going on here. You've got the bison, of course, who made it across. Well, what we think is that there seems to be a filtering effect, and we're trying to find decent evidence to really establish this, that there was a filter bridge across that zone of the San Juan Islands and so forth, that certain animals were able to make it all the way over to Vancouver Island and some were not. And by the way, amongst those was the ground sloth. Made it to the San Juans, but we don't have any ground sloth fossils on Vancouver Island. Well, what's the difference? The gap between the San Juans and Vancouver Island is occupied by Haro Strait. And Haro Strait is much deeper than the straits that divide the various islands in the San Juans or divide them from the mainland. So Haro Strait could well have been a barrier through the entire time period, whereas the islands could have been connected to the mainland to the east anyway. So we're thinking in terms of a filter bridge. That's the model we're applying. I'm not going to say it's been demonstrated and I'm going to pound on the desk and say, yes, we got evidence for it. At the moment, it's beginning to look quite likely that we had a filter bridge. So here is a view of the San Juans. I'm going to use the pointer here. In the map, you can see the San Juans in a central position, really. Orcas Island is this horseshoe thing in the upper portion of the San Juan. San Juan Island is here. Between them and the mainland, as you can see from the shaded blue, the light blue here indicates relatively shallow areas. And so if you drop the sea levels down a little bit, you could establish probably one or two little land bridges and get individuals like the bison and other species over to these islands. And look at the number of bison finds we've made now. There's really quite a good sample from Orcas and also from San Juan Island. And these are the bison finds on Victoria Saanich Peninsula, not found any further inland. This is a very distinctive little area ecologically. So I've outlined the margins of what might have been a filter bridge that existed for perhaps 1,000 or a couple of thousand years. And we're continuing to investigate this. By the way, Haro Strait I mentioned. Some people might say Haro Strait, but anyway, Haro Strait. I don't really know how to pronounce it. It's a deeper area through here. The modern strait, of course, is its full width, but its width has been exaggerated by lateral wave cutting, and this is a shallow wave cut platform on the west side here. So the modern width of Haro Strait is probably an exaggeration developed over the last 10,000 years from what was formerly a narrower condition. And this was really the outflow of the Fraser River. The Fraser is not far to the north. This would be the outflow of the Fraser. And in fact, Haro Strait is described by oceanographers as even today kind of estuarine in character. There's still fresh water riding over the top of seawater. It mixes reluctantly. And so the water column is a little unusual in Haro Strait. And that's relevant to us because if there is a kind of fresh water amount, and if in late glacial times there was even more fresh water riding over marine water, it could have frozen and had sea ice. So maybe there is actually the possibility of ice producing a bit of a bridge there. Oh, bison arrives. Anyway, so I took this photograph from an airplane somewhat to the southwest of Victoria. So we're looking across Victoria here, looking over to San Juan Island, across Haro Strait, and James Island and so forth, and in the distance, the mainland. So you can see the sort of the general perspective here. All of these animals sort of staged and waiting on the San Juans for the next train west, and evidently some of them didn't catch the train. The ground sloths seem not to have done so, but you never know. Negative evidence in science we always ache about, because the fact that we haven't found something doesn't mean we're not going to find it. And so of course we're still attentive to the possibility that it might be found over on Vancouver Island. And ground sloths, you say, well, could they swim? Well, this is Megalonyx jeffersoni, Jefferson's ground sloth, and it's the most widely distributed ground sloth of all. from Mexico, from Central America, all the way up to the Yukon, from the eastern seaboard to the western seaboard, everywhere. It had a good ability to disperse in crossing major rivers, so I think it could have swum, but maybe not across a body of salt water as large as Haro Strait. We still got to find that out. Anyway, what was the climate, or what was the environment like in the area for these bison? From pollen studies, Richard Hebda has done the pollen work. This is an open pine parkland. Estelle Leopold did the pollen work on San Juan Islands, Richard on Vancouver Island, and in both cases there's evidence for an open pine parkland with grassy patches at the time that the bison were there. But oh my gosh, by 12,000 years ago, the forest had switched over to a more closed canopy, Douglas fir, hemlock forest. Very different. And, oh gee, the bison weren't there anymore. Well, you look at it, and one of the things that we would characteristically have said maybe 10 or 20 years ago is, well, climate change brought vegetation change. The bison lost their habitat, they died out. But was that really the story? Can we turn that around a little bit? Could the disappearance of these animals have caused the forest to change? And there's increasing evidence for that these animals act as sort of environmental or ecological engineers by selective cropping of things. Bison eat a lot of different things, and one of the things they do is they nip off shoots, little tree shoots and things like that. They help to maintain open lands. And so they can maintain a forest, an open forest community, kind of a patchy forest community. And if you take them away, then these sprouts will keep on growing into trees and you'll get a more closed forest. So actually, this is plausible. It may not be that climate change got rid of these animals, in which case we got to figure out, what now? What got rid of them? And by the way, the megafauna, we're going to talk about all these animals as megafauna. They're big things. But and the mice become microfauna by comparison. But anyway, the megafauna could have imported pioneer plants as well. This is a really important theme. They might have brought some of the early vegetation with them when they were moving into this area. Seeds caught on their fur, but also things in their digestive tracts that didn't get completely digested. So we can, well, just a thought about these things. Bison do a lot of things. They trample. They pack the substrate. That's going to affect the way plants behave or succeed. Bison can overgraze, of course. They did on the plains. They can inhibit aspens by nibbling on them, and other trees too. Aspens go by shoots. They send out suckers underground and expand that way. Other trees have to produce seedlings. But anyway, bison affect fire frequency and tall grass as well, contributing to woody plants. So at the same time as they're creating openings in the forest, they're also creating little patches of woody plants in the prairies by working on the grasses. So it's a very complex story, but they certainly can affect the vegetative communities. So the answer to the question is not simply, climate change, vegetation change, animals become extinct. Let's look at the bears. This is the lower jaw of giant short-faced bear from San Juan Island. It was found by Dave DeThier of the Geological Survey, U.S. Geological Survey, many years ago, and it's in the Burke Museum today. You can see relative sizes indicated here in this drawing by Ruth Ann Border. So we got a grizzly bear here, we got a brown bear here. There's our short-faced bear, a long-legged fellow. We're not quite sure the role it played, whether it was a hyper-carnivore or whether it was more of a scavenger, but it was certainly an important member of the community. But its relative today is a frugivore, eats fruit. These bears here, the smaller things, the brown bear and the grizzly bear, they like buffalo berry, Shepherdea canadensis. Buffalo berry really, really likes bears. Because when buffalo berries pass through the bear's digestive tract, the seeds become scarified and they germinate more readily. So there's a coevolutionary relationship between the two. And lo and behold, when we look at the pollen records for these areas and for a lot of Western North America, in the early postglacial pollen record, there's a sudden pulse, a surge of Shepherdia. To me, that says the bears arrived. To somebody else, it might just say, oh, there was buffalo berry there before in the pioneer community, before other things got established. To me, that says bears arrived. And there, I took this photo up near Johns Hopkins Inlet again. This is my view. One of these ecological engineers busily doing his job, actually, in the early deglaciated environment, because this environment was deglaciated about 200 years ago, maximum. The area there was covered over by ice not so long ago. And so this is a pioneer situation. There's the bear, and the rest of the story ensues. Okay, so what else could have killed these animals then? Whoops, how's our time? I want to make sure that I don't go too far over time. An hour extra wouldn't hurt. Anyway, but so rising sea levels. Oh, wait a minute. Rising sea levels. The animals get to the islands. Rising sea levels. The animals become more isolated. This is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because for a time, if the animals could get to these islands, they might have been able to swim readily from one island to another and maintain what we call a metapopulation. That is, where there are individual island populations, but the survival really depends upon their interconnectedness and their ability to move back and forth. So this metapopulation survived for a time, but decreasing connectedness as the sea levels rose and increasingly isolated the islands, then stranded these little local populations, which may not have been able to maintain their biodiversity, they may not have been able to maintain their viability in numbers, in the face of predatory pressure, for example, running into a sort of death spiral. So this is what we call a metapopulation crisis. And whoa, that's a real possibility, that maybe it's just rising sea level that causes the disappearance. But, oh no, wait a minute, Vancouver Island, surely there was a bit more room there. Well, it was just Saanich to Victoria. That's not really a big area. Beyond that was closed canopy forest, even when the bison were around. Maybe that wasn't enough to sustain a bison population. So we got to think about this. And it's a vital lesson because this is happening to modern species. If you've talked or heard from people about habitat fragmentation, the fact that we're building barriers like highways and so forth, breaking up populations into smaller groups which have to try to maintain connectedness, whoa, it's the same problem. So, this is a bit of a cartoon. On the right there, you see a kind of a chart of different kinds of metapopulation structures. And so, in that diagram, the uppermost one is a highly connected example where all of the different patches are able to connect with one another. As you move down, you've got increasing patch isolation, and you've got the mainland island situation where some might be connected, others not. And then finally, you get down to the bottom of highly isolated, and there's no interconnectedness at all. And now you've got isolated populations. This is bad news for large animals, for megafauna, that need to have that interconnectedness to maintain viable populations. I mean, where do we see it today? We see it in the national parks. We see it in Banff, where they're building these wildlife bridges. Why? Not just because, oh, the animals are migratory and they like to go over to someplace else to get their grazing or their food or whatever, because they need to be linked as part of this bigger metapopulation so they can maintain biodiversity and maintain population resilience. So to this day, today, we are dealing with this same issue in a very aggressive way, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem for us in the future because of our impact in the causing of habitat fragmentation. Okay, so the small horns, as I mentioned, might suggest an island effect. And island effects have been documented for a long time. There are many examples showing size decreases in mammals that get over onto islands. Even the complete loss of horns and antlers, two different things, of course, there. So there are examples of little bovid species that virtually lose their horns completely, cervids, antlered deer, and so forth. sometimes within a few generations, they seem to already be showing reduction in antler size. And there are other examples, flightlessness, and in case of tortoises, increases in size. That has to do with predatory pressures or lack thereof. But anyway, so predators have something to do with this. And wow, how does this relate to the examples we've got here? Our bison have smaller horns. Okay, another unintelligible diagram for you. I graphed the size, the horn spread, tip-to-tip horn spread of bison on the plains from modern times back to 10,000 plus, 11,000 radiocarbon years. So this is actually 12,000 cal years. And you notice that bison from Antiquus here have become smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of their horn spread over time. Now, their bodies did not become that much smaller. They did become smaller, but the horn size really became much, much smaller through time on the plains, not in an isolated island. What was happening on the plains over the last 10,000 years? Predatory pressure, human predation, drive kills, buffalo drives, shortening of life expectancy from 20 years to about 12 years. These all have big impacts on bison. And probably the horns would be the first place where you would notice it. Interestingly enough, though, if you go back in time into the Ice Age, the La Brea bison, which are in California, La Brea tar pits, they're about 14,000, 15,000 years old. They're consistent with this, but not bigger. But the ones on the San Juans and Victoria, Vancouver Island, they're smaller than this overall trend. In other words, they're off the trend. If they were moving up from the south, those animals were getting smaller at a different rate than the ones that we see out on the plains. So obviously this is going to be a complicated story, but one that is nevertheless quite striking in terms of the information. Casper is a site in Wyoming, an archaeological bison kill site. You can see that's a meter stick. That's a big animal. This is a specimen from Calgary, recently found, and the one from, this is the Ayer Pond specimen from Orcas Island. Okay, well, horn cores are part of the display mechanism. They're kind of wasteful, energetically wasteful. Are they really needed to that extent? Well, they're needed for defense, but a lot of the horn core stuff is for male head banging. And as you know, male head banging is not necessarily the greatest thing, but it's a strategy used by these animals. It's preceded by a kind of stare down where these animals are looking at one another and glowering and looking and measuring the sizes of their respective horns and thinking like, that wouldn't be a good idea. I think I'll just leave. So that's what the display is all about. But under dietary stress, you'd think, well, that's probably one of the first things that's going to be affected. This is a viable hypothesis. Patch populations in the Pacific Northwest, if they became a little isolated, they couldn't migrate after forage. So if they ran out of forage in one area, they couldn't migrate to another area necessarily to pick up the losses. But there's something more than that. There are two kinds of grasses. You can simplify them to, say, grasses of relatively moist environments and grasses of relatively dry environments. They have two different photosynthetic pathways. I'm generalizing here. But they mature at different times of year. On the plains, you have both kinds of grasses. And the bison are delighted because there are two productivity peaks of the grasses. They've got grass productivity all through the spring through the summer, right into the early fall. On the islands out here in the Pacific Northwest, there's one productivity peak. C3 only, the damp grasses. And it's fall into winter. So not only is it one single short productivity peak for these animals, they can't move somewhere else and find better grass, but it's also out of whack in seasonal sense with the timing of calving, of birthing. Whereas on the plains, it's just perfect for when calves are born. And so these animals are out of sync with the grass availability, and in a dietary sense, then, they might not have been under optimal circumstances even to begin with. More to the point, just when I thought I had it all figured out, then there's some genetic studies of feral sheep that have lived they've lived in a wild sense on St. Kilda, on the St. Kilda archipelago, Solway Island, for thousands of years. And their horn size is just all over the board. There are long-horned ones and short-horned ones and virtually no-horned ones. And it turns out that there's a genetic link, actually, to the horn size. And then you'd think, oh, well, if there's a genetic link, you would select for one size, probably. Then one would be optimal. Well, as it turns out, the ones with the long horns, the males, have greater reproductive success. I said, wow, they flex their muscles and do their thing, and they've got greater success. But they don't live as long. They have short lives. The ones with small horns have less reproductive success, but they live a lot longer, so they can compensate in a sense. And by the way, when two big males are headbanging, there's other males around who are taking advantage of the females. So they're like humans, aren't they? But anyway, so this is a case in genetics of balanced polymorphism. Both sizes are being selected for. And so now we've got to do additional sampling and see if we've got greater variation in horn size, or whether they're just all small, or whether we've got something very like the Solway example. More work to do. Well, finally, looking into the other possibility that human hunters might have played a role in the extirpation, or in the case extinction, of some of these species. Again, we've got sites indicated there on the lower right. The red dots are Clovis projectile points, that is human material that would date pretty close to 13,000 years ago. It'll be over 13,000 years ago. And so humans were in the area at that time, and more to the point, at both the Mastodon site on Olympic Peninsula and at Ayr Pond, we have evidence that looks like human activity. The Mastodon has a bone projectile sticking in to the top of a rib, the proximal area of a rib. Some people are trying to figure out ways that maybe a machine could have pushed it in there, just at the time of discovery. So there will always be critics, and critics are good, devil's advocates. You've got to keep challenging the information. I think this is a pretty good case for human activity, despite the fact there's still debate. And this is 14,000 years ago. Others think it is too, by the way, because it's published in Science magazine as a good case, but there have been a lot of other people challenging it. On Orcas Island, up at the top, you see a bison from the Cadden site, which is quite small, maybe a female. And here's the big male from, the lower one is the big male from Ayr Pond. And you can see the crescentic blows from smashing. You can see the fracturing here, and these are old fractures. They're not fresh fractures from a machine. They've been stained by the burial environment. They're not fresh breaks. It isn't that the machine, the backhoe, did this. So we believe that there's good evidence here for, again, smashing of bones by human activity. And again, that's 14,000 years ago. So humans did play a role in this area, and a very important one. So, okay, why have we got so few finds? Well, soils almost everywhere in that area are acidic. They just eat up bones like that. They're gone within a matter of a few hundreds, if not, a few decades perhaps in some cases, but forest soils are too acidic for the preservation of bone. So we had to go there and work out our burial environment to see if there was something in common in all of these sites. And we devised a discovery strategy. All of the sites that we had the same sequence: glacial marine drift, that is from the last glacial as it was retreating, the last glaciers, marine drift containing shells and drop stones from the ice. The shells themselves are calcareous, and they are at the base of the section. Just above them, as the land emerged, then you had this kind of uneven surface, and you had ponds that were developing, freshwater ponds. There were just marls in the base of them, but they were filling in initially with silt, and the bones are there. Over top, then, these things changed to peat deposits, and they filled in with peat. So the bones are at the base of the peat. They wouldn't preserve in the peat. The peat is a little bit acidic, but at the base, you've got deposits that are neutralized in acidity by the presence of the calcareous material, the shells. In other words, you've got lime there, just like throwing lime on a lawn, and which we have to do in the Pacific Northwest. If we want a lawn, you've got to keep throwing lime on it so that the soil isn't acidic. Okay, so that's our discovery mode, because this is characteristic of every site in which we have found these bones. Every one of them looks exactly the same. So make predictions then on this basis. And Steve Kennedy on Orcas Island, on that basis, went out to another excavation in a similar situation, predicting we'd find more bone material, more bison. It worked. Grant Keddy, with a waterline excavation in Victoria, in an area where we knew there to be a peat pond that had filled in, again, suggested there might be bison bones at the base of it. Boom, another bison. In this case, a tooth, but the tooth was right on the interface between the underlying silt and the overlying peat, and underneath were glacial marine deposits with shells. So this works, and we can now focus our search. But the problem is, those are not necessarily the places that the animals like to live. It's a taphonomic issue. Those are the places where they were preserved. They were probably much more abundant. They were probably much more widespread. We're only seeing a tiny fragment of the story. We're looking through little windows here, little taphonomic windows. Okay, so in closing, we've answered some questions, but of course, we've raised more questions. Good, good, that'll keep us busy. The findings have conservation relevance, actually. They're relevant to the modern day. We've got a discovery model now, a paradigm that we can use. But, you know, beyond that, the finds also contribute very strongly to a sense of place for the people who live in those areas. This is exciting stuff. And the local people have really bought into it, where these finds have emerged. The weavers and the quilters of Orcas Island put together a bison antiquus. As you can see there, I'm so delighted that it was wonderful. In 2008, we had a bit of a reception at the museum, and they created this thing. And it was just a wondrous creation. I was overwhelmed. It was so beautiful in its own way. Not just to look at, but I mean, it was a beautiful thought. The community really loves having this story attached to it. Sense of place is something very important. Drumheller knows that. The attachment to the dinosaurs, the attachment to the museums, sense of place is extremely important. Part of the acceptance that we've had in the community as well has been that in the case of Steve and Randall and myself, we actually self-funded a lot of the early work. We even paid for the radiocarbon dates because we thought it was so important. We've got to get this moving, and we're not going to wait for somebody, an angel, to come flying in and give us something here. So we just started it on our own. Several papers have resulted from this, and one of the sidebars to this was based on the Orcas Island work. We received an award of excellence from the State Historic Preservation Office in Washington, and presented by the governor. They think this is important. And it really is important. It's not just something that's in a scientific paper somewhere. This has public value and importance. And for that, I'm very grateful. And for your presence here today, I am extremely grateful. I love it that you're here. I'm thanking the people, of course, who invited me and have been kind of taking care of me while I'm here. And that is indeed the end. Thank you very much.